paper, like, I'm going to write it regardless if it's just like for extra credit or per paper or something, but is that paper related enough to be my paper for this topic or no? Because it's not about really Marshall Marvin.
Nope.
Okay.
Okay. All right. You are being recorded, so.
We are being recorded. You're also being recorded.
And will be
Mr. Gaddis.
Well, not anymore. Bye.
All right, guys. So you want to talk through general issues first, and then go into specific topics.
Okay.
We could do that. We could also talk about the decision and where people stand on whether it was the correct decision in a legal lens, like whether you should.
Would that be a good way to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying yes or no, but just that's something that all of our papers are going to have to include, and to maybe make sure that we're all comfortable with that.
You're just trying out that idea.
I want to take out some legal documents.
I'm going to do the same. I'm going to take it all in Marbury.
I'm just gonna sit in front of the camera and open Facebook.
Marbury Madison, number 13.
Oh, you have all your.
How John Marshall answered question number 3. Marbury Madison, number 11.
Are we gonna write this?
You had number 11?
Identifying proteins and amino acids. That's not part of this.
Oh, here's a 13.
Probably quoted from articles.
Thank you for joining the gentleman's seminar. We're
Wait, guys, do we have
Jacob Foster, the head of student council. Matthew Black, the head of mock trial club, which meets approximately 13 times a week. Eric Black, who competently wears his mathlete's shirt 3 to 5 days a week. And Isaac Alwyn Sagan, who is just here for the ride and future leader of gentleman's seminar. Thank you.
Wait, here's a quick question. Do we have a document that includes all of the key lines that John Marshall left out?
We have all the questions. We have the question. We have the document with all the questions we were looking at.
Oh, okay. We have wrapping up Flint versus Falwell here.
All right, let's get going, boys.
Okay.
Okay. Just gonna pull up Federal 78. Federal 78 Constitution. I don't really need anything else beyond this.
Whenever's ready.
Take your start. I've been like.
As you were.
Legal arguments.
You got that one, Jacob?
Yeah.
Hamilton?
Okay. Okay. So, Matt, what are your thoughts on this case? Let's take out Isaac's idea.
I think that Marshall's decision was definitely logical. I'm still thinking through whether it was correct constitutionally. But I think that it was logical because if the Constitution was not the supreme document, then I think that we wouldn't really have anything to base our laws off of, and I think we wouldn't have a functioning government. So I think that the Constitution, it's necessary to protect the Constitution, and in order to protect the Constitution, there needs to be a body of people who can make decisions based off of that and have the power to overrule laws which are like contrasting to the Constitution.
So that, like, if we are to have constitutional supremacy, we need judicial supremacy. So can actually.
I mean, yeah, I think that that's the best. I think that judicial supremacy is an option. I think that it's the best option, but I wouldn't be. Say that there was like legislative supremacy. Yeah, I think judicial supremacy is the best option.
Do you think it should be tempered at all, or should the power of judicial review strictly be in the hands of the court?
I think it should strictly be in the hands of the court.
Okay.
Because I think that if it's in if you think of the other options, if it's in the executive branch, then the president one person has too much power, in my opinion. And if it's in the legislative branch, then
The laws they're passing are never going to come
they
into
control their
Yeah, they just can create any law. If
They
not
control
before
their
it.
So I think that the judicial branch is the least biased of the branches.
Also,
When laws are made.
I agree with that. I also would add to that, and then I'll start there and then backtrack a little bit. And if anyone has anything to say, obviously jump in. I think like we see this in the political climate today, but it's become. I mean, people were following the elections in the past couple weeks, and they're like, it's such a big deal for whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans to have control of the House and whatever. And I think that if the legislative branch were to have this, be able to have control over judicial review, like our country would sway far too much in one direction.
The courts.
The court, no, I'm saying the court.
But even in the
What
courts,
do you mean, the courts?
the court's power of judicial review
the-
depends on suit.
Whenever
The
there's
court
a,
can't
no,
just decide.
I'm just saying that whenever there's
The court can't just decide. So what I'm saying is whether or not the majority
only one.
No, but
But then there
my
has to be
point is, my point is that the court can't, like, the court has to give reason for something to be, unconstitutional or constitutional or not. And like, while it's important whether they're Democratic or Republican people, in the seats of the court or like Federalists back then, like, that's why there were people who were appointed, I think it would be far more difficult for the court to just take control and move the country in one direction or another, whereas if the legislative branch is the majority Democrat, majority Senate, they have a ton of control of not only the passing of the laws and putting the country in one direction, like pushing the country in one direction or another.
The
They
legislative
also
branch
would be able
serves
to
an
decide,
agenda.
they serve an agenda and they'd be able to control that agenda to an extent I think would be problematic.
Agreed. I think that the main difference between having the judicial review in the legislature and in the judiciary is that the legislature serves an agenda. They're trying to accomplish something with each law that they make and if they have judicial review with each ruling they made, while the judicial branch is serving the law.
Yeah, I also think that, if any, I mean, let's say that we're like taking this conversation back to 1800, if any branch has the power to do judicial review, they are going to be supreme in some way.
True.
But I think that having it be in the judiciary makes it the least possibly volatile.
I agree. As Jefferson said, this member of the government was at first considered as the most harmless and helpless of all its organs.
Right, where is that?
This is
What packet is that?
13.
packet 13. I mean, he's basically saying without the power of judicial review, what power does the judicial body really have?
Yeah.
It's
Because the executive
$18.25.
and legislative branches have power on their own, and with the ability to run judicial review, kind of, even if it gives them a little bit more supremacy, brings them to that level. I also think, like, just in terms of reviewing laws, the judicial body is the most capable and best suited to do that. I also, going back to reading the Constitution, I think it makes sense and it's very, very important to our country to have this like writing that reigns supreme above all other, and for us that is the Constitution. And I think you could argue how he reads the act, like the Judicial Act, the Judiciary Act of 1789. But I will say that I think when we're comparing the Constitution to other things, like in terms of balancing test, the Constitution always stands number one, because that is the principles on which in the Constitution outlined, are the principles on which our country is founded and should be lived by both the people and by the government and the extent of their power.
So I think I think we essentially all agree on the importance of the constitutional supremacy, and I have some mixed feelings, but not enough to really entertain some opposition to judicial supremacy or supremacy of the Supreme Court.
But you agree with the points that were made?
Yeah, I agree with
Also, it's
that.
interesting, it's not abundantly clear whether or not Marshall's actually arguing for judicial supremacy in itself. Him saying that the things that he said it's debated now, it remains unclear whether or not he was actually arguing for judicial supremacy himself, which is interesting.
Yeah, and that so I think try to focus this in a little bit, obviously kind of the most meaningful question about this is this right? But it's also in some ways the least consequential. Judicial review seems to be a pretty secure precedent.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking more of in the context of judicial review seemingly being a secure precedent, that's not about to change in the foreseeable future. About this case, I think a couple of us have hinted at having some issue with John Marshall's ruling.
strictly in the
Yeah, like in the, like,
case.
did he get it right? Which I think might be the other half of the question, like, you know, doesn't matter if he got it right or not. How did he get it right or wrong? Like, how would it be consequential? If we think that his understanding of how Article 3, Section 2, affects original jurisdiction, if we think in fact that, like, no, he's wrong, the legislature does have the authority to modify original jurisdiction, and the whole premise of the case is off, like, does that change, like, anything? And is there are there any, like, conceits, I think that's the right word, in his legal arguments? Like, are there seemingly, like, in the legal philosophy he's exercising, do we see any problems as well as the reasoning?
I think that
Wait, are we talking about the ruling? His
Marshall's ruling.
decision
Yeah,
to establish
Marshall,
yeah.
like,
his decision to establish judicial review, or his decision to rule for,
his ruling on
in
Marbury
favor,
versus
yeah,
Madison,
about
and
standing.
including judicial review.
Yeah.
so including establishing.
Everything, I mean,
like,
the original ruling itself and then coming
Yeah.
to the
the,
conclusion
like,
that judicial
100
review is.
pages or
in
whatever.
my group's the group quiz, Matt and I were in the same group. For the last question, we kind of, which
Like
reading do we adhere to?
Oh, let's read that. We could-
Yeah, we kind of did process of elimination and got that the best reading would be that Congress has the power to add cases to the court's original jurisdiction, which would say that if it was interpreted that way, then Marshall's ruling in Marbury versus Madison would be legally incorrect. But at the same time, I don't think that makes his argument for judicial review invalid. I personally think he used that at the wrong time. I think Stewart v. Laird is a much better case, and that I don't see why Marshall didn't switch around the order of the two and
Alright,
maybe
so
rule on one
can I try to
versus
give an
the
answer
other.
to this?
Yeah.
Alright, so, this is a little bit unfair, because Mr. Cadden and I were talking about this yesterday, it's fine.
Fair?
It's not unfair.
The only thing I would jump in on it, and just from a process perspective, you could talk about whatever you want, but just to note that you guys were gonna talk about the legal part of the case, what the case meant legally, and what you read, and this is a slightly different topic.
Yeah.
You can do that, I don't care, I'm just naming
It's
that just
fine.
so you're aware. Fine.
But I mean, this would be helpful to know, so.
Yeah, I can say this, then we can go back to it.
I was gonna say legally, so Matt.
Nothing unfair, Matt.
Let's have this conversation.
okay, so-
You guys, then let's talk as
So
before.
so in the case of judicial review, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, we talked so much about why John Marshall was a genius and how he got out of this. So when he ruled that the court couldn't rule in this case because they didn't have original jurisdiction, Madison and Jefferson were okay because Marbury didn't get his appointment and wasn't issued the writ of mandamus to Madison, and Marbury was the Federalists were fine with it because he didn't rule against the laws that were clearly laid out in front of him, thereby allowing for the continuation of power in the judiciary. And so although it was a very controversial ruling, no side was coming out of this and saying we are not going to respect the Supreme Court moving forward.
What about in Stewart versus Laird?
Okay, so in the case of Stewart versus Laird, if Marbury had struck down if Marshall had struck down the ruling of the Judiciary Act of 1802, and if he had chosen to do judicial review there, saying that it was unconstitutional because they were taking away the seats which were actually given to the justices for life, then the Democratic Republicans would have been very frustrated
But
with
how would
him,
they-
and then they would have not respected the court anymore because they were actually mad with the implications of his decision.
So
it was really about,
Federalists have been mad?
in which case?
Wouldn't the Federalists have been mad that he made such a
In which
not
case?
him because he recused himself, in Stewart versus Laird, that the court made a decision which seems to go against the Constitution?
Well, I think two things missing. One is like, I think what you're touching on is kind of the requirement to action, whereas like the consensus, like what he wrote in Marbury versus Madison didn't require Jefferson to take any action. It just kind of traded in current political power for like long-term legal precedent, and like Thomas Jefferson could just refuse to comply. There was nothing he had to comply with.
Right.
Like he could have marched in and like ripped it up, but like short of that, there's nothing he could do. Versus like he could just refuse to let like the justices take their seats in 1802, and it's a little unclear of like, I think we were touching on the class, like if 1802 was repealed and 1801 was restored, is it like just all the same justices resume? Like there's a lot more complexities that do require action.
That's true.
I think the other thing is that precedent is a little bit shakier because it's also 1802 is undoing the Judiciary Act of 1801, which I think also had some legislative issues.
But the court does have, Congress does have the power to create seats and fill them.
Potentially, but also, this is what I've been writing my extra credit paper on, but the courts,
Time out, what?
I've just been obsessed with how 1801 is like super unconstitutional. I think Jefferson was in the legal right not to appoint Marbury. But like,
alright, onwards.
Yeah, but like that's not super relevant to this conversation. What I will say is about the Judiciary Act of 1801, there's some mechanisms like how it actually creates all these seats is by destroying a bunch of pre-existing circuit courts, and while it's not removing judges from their seats, it is removing courts, which, like, as we know from 1802, it's like kind of iffy if that's actually
You can actually do that, yeah.
Yeah, it also seemingly gives a number of judges powers which are less than constitutional, appoints them in unconstitutional
The
fashion.
justice of the peace.
Yeah, and then like a lot of them are given authority which might not be delegated to the judicial branch. And then finally is like this question which is beyond the question of simple precedent. Like I have some, I think there's some reason based on the vocabulary of the Constitution to believe that this is implied. But like even ignoring like specific precedent or wording is the intent of the Constitution, like is the legal tradition here to establish an independent judiciary? Like is it being violated by the notion that you can pack the courts and double them? Of like, and this I think connects somewhat to the broader kind of
Like it goes against originalist intent.
yeah, it goes against the original intent. And like as we were talking about, like if the judiciary is like the least active and most reliable, is that somehow compromised if you're doubling or tripling the size of the court?
Okay, Jacob, can you repeat what you were saying about the action versus inaction?
Oh, just that it's like, in order to comply with Marbury versus Madison,
It was not requiring
Jefferson,
anybody to do
nobody
it.
had
it was
to do
like,
anything.
it's like, here's the status quo, but the status quo is because of this, because judicial
Since
review.
neither side was being forced to do anything, neither side could take action against any actions.
Jefferson could not comply.
Like Marshall was saying that he doesn't deserve, like, okay, Marbury could argue that he deserves to have, that he deserves to become justice of the peace, whatever, but he's not like he's not telling Marbury that he has to like go to the bathroom and do something. So Marbury can't be like, I don't want to go to the bathroom, and he's not telling Jefferson that he has to order the troops on troops on Madison. So Jefferson can't be like, no, I don't want to order the troops on anything on Madison. So since what Jacobs is saying, correct me if I'm wrong, since neither side is being forced to do anything, there's nothing that they can't really be up in arms about anything. So then that's a really good time to put in judicial review rather than Stuart v. Laird, where a side would be unhappy and would have
Can we take it back?
reason.
Since we understand, if we take it to legal.
I have one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
So in Stuart v. Laird,
That would be part of why he recused.
Yeah.
when you were saying that, because how I took it is that in Stuart v. Laird, the Democratic Republicans, what action would the Democratic Republicans have taken if Marshall were to establish judicial review in that case?
Well, I think, one is what the resolution in that case where we would be establishing judicial review would be undoing the Judiciary Act of 1802.
So they'd have to fill the seats.
Yeah, so they would
figure out how to fill the seats.
Yeah, so it A, introduces those complexities, and B, like it's entirely possible that all the Democratic Republicans would just comply, but it also goes against their political interests to suddenly repack the courts, but with their political enemies. In which case there's like a big political incentive, and then somebody's just like, their security was threatened by these judges. Like these judges had previously tried to send them to
this is
prison.
something, Jacob's exact point is something I wanted to talk about and add to. One of the questions in the packet is talking about does it,
Which packet?
should, of the, like,
2 or 3.
of the, it's the seminar notes packet.
Okay.
It's like, should historical context of a ruling matter? Some people argue that Marshall may have registered a ruling in order to state, like, we looked at that test, like, why is Marshall such a genius? Because in this historical first of all, in the interest of federalism, it would look really bad to make this court look weak and whatever, and you don't want the court to have to cave to the President Jefferson, and you don't want the court to not be able to do anything. And it's the same thing here. It's like, yeah, maybe the Democratic Republicans would have complied, but within this historical context, it would have been incredibly uncomfortable and opposing all of their best interests to do that. So it's not only politically speaking, yes. So it's not only, and this is what's really interesting and why the context is so important, is because it's not only looking at it from a legal lens. Of course, the legal lens may be the most important factor, but a lot of this is motivated by political and historical context. And so you're not sure, Jacob's not sure, and I'm not sure whatever, that how the Democratic Republicans would have responded, but it's very reasonable to say that the Democratic Republicans would have been up in arms having to fill up courts with people that directly.
And that isn't the case in Marbury.
And that is not the case in Marbury v. Madison.
Alright, can we get back to the legal?
Yeah, let's go back to legal. So let's talk about,
Let's talk about
let's talk about,
Article 3, Section 2.
yeah, let's just talk about whether Marshall's ruling was legally sound, and let's go into the documents that
relate to that.
That's some of us have.
Do you want to send you pictures?
Afterwards,
Okay.
until I have the Constitution open, I'm good. This is all I need to know.
I was about to say, if the Constitution open, you have nothing to worry about, my friends. Alright.
I think Article 3, Section 2 is in like 6 different packets.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's that important. Someone want to read it? I'm happy to read it, I don't care.
Go for it. Which packet are you in?
I am in packet number 11, I believe.
In all cases-
Article 3, Don Marshall and the Marbury ruling.
Packet 11?
Yeah.
Jacob, go for it.
In all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, and those in which a state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction.
What are
Period.
response to the
In
question?
all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make.
So, as I was saying before, our group responded to this. Can I read the response?
The majority opinion of
Nah.
Luck, Kerplak, and
Siegel.
Siegel.
Well, in a sense of Siegel, she's on in the general.
Yeah, she's not the one in the center. Alright, is it, history group.
We're kidding, we're not actually elite, we're all inclusive.
Yeah, this is not non-British. Okay. That's non-British.
We all know Annie Siegel was probably the best legal opinion of the three.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's kind of long, but I'm just going to read the whole thing, because why not? Article 3, Section 2 cannot be saying that Congress has the power to subtract original jurisdiction, because that most obviously nullifies the Constitution. If so, what would be the point of laying out examples in which the Supreme Court should have original jurisdiction? This also disproves the notion that the Exceptions Clause grants Congress the power to make whatever changes it wants to the powers and jurisdictions of the SCOTUS, because if Congress cannot subtract original jurisdiction, then it clearly does not have the power to make whatever changes it wants. Likewise, Section 2 cannot be interpreted to mean that Congress can subtract appellate jurisdiction from the Supreme Court, because that gives Congress the power to take away all power from the Supreme Court, which would upset the system of checks and balances laid out in the Constitution. I think that's a fair enough argument. And then the third is, by process of elimination, the only remaining option is that Congress should have the power to add cases to the court's original jurisdiction. The implications of this interpretation are not nearly as severe as those of the other interpretations, because they do not result in the collapse or nullifying of any major form or component of government. As has already been stated, restating, and then the best defense against the reading that Congress has power to add to original jurisdiction is this guy Amar's argument, but that argument is based on semantics and the interpretation of the word exception, because it doesn't say augmentations. So it's kind of a weak argument. And then the only foreseeable implication of this interpretation is that Marshall's interpretation and ruling in Marbury v. Madison would be legally incorrect. However, that interpretation is not too harsh, for the main precedent set in Marbury v. Madison could have been set in countless other cases, or still accepted to be true from this case.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're making the argument that essentially because the alternatives seem to be going against like founders' intent, reason, and like almost dangerous of like either the Congress has the power to mitigate the authority, like the legislature has the power to limit the judicial branch's like authority, or like it has to be modifying like original versus appellate jurisdiction instead of just like sum total of their power.
And if they were to modify original jurisdiction, it would mean that Congress has the power to change things written in the Constitution without going through the amendment process. And that's dangerous too.
Though I think, like, obviously, I think the intent behind it is like key, and understanding like from Federal 78 that like separation of powers is essential. I think though that both, like as Akil Reed and Moore was pointing out, like it's not just semantic, like it's pretty explicit in the writing of its like exceptions and such regulations is listed like after as to law and fact, both of which are like the grammar of it seems very clear. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations. These are all qualifiers about the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, not referring to the original jurisdiction.
Do you think that, what is your interpretation of that clause?
So my understanding is that it's giving the legislature to make exceptions through passing regulations to the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Though what I would say is that I don't think exceptions implies like some dramatic redrawing of appellate authority.
I so agree with you.
Exceptions is like a very specific term. Like
I
it's to
agree,
say a
but
case.
it doesn't, there's no, like it doesn't, there's no way to regulate that.
I think if we set exceptions as individual cases,
But then
which
couldn't-
is a rational reading of the word exceptions,
Okay.
it's
I
inherently
would-
limiting like
It says
Congress
still
is-
have appellate jurisdiction, and then I think that this is a new, but it would have been better if I pulled it, but I think it's a new clause, both as law and fact with such exceptions, and that and still fits in with the appellate jurisdiction.
yeah.
I think it's
So
all
I think
fine
we're
too.
not-
Yeah.
You think
And
it's
I
all
think there's
about
also
appellate?
some
Yeah.
constant, I think there's also some historical precedent of like one of the things it's regulating is cases with foreign powers and with states, which are both kind of like cases where deeply sensitive and urgent political issues could be
Yeah.
at stake. So
Yes,
I
the
think
most
like,
sensitive
Oh,
of the Supreme Court
so-
issues.
So you think the key is
Except-
that
except-
exceptions,
Can we
Like, I
play
think
this
the idea
out?
that-
So let's say
I think that exceptions is limiting.
yeah,
let's
because
say
it's
that-
individual cases.
Let's say that reading is correct, and the only power of the Congress in this situation is that they can make exceptions. They can make regulations and
Appellate jurisdiction.
of appellate jurisdictions.
Yeah.
How does that play out in
Like-
in our judicial system?
I think the reasoning behind it is when certain and particularly dramatic cases come, the idea that the legislature can actually stop them from going to the Supreme Court is somewhat like a necessary check on the Supreme Court's authority embedded in the Constitution, because the idea that like, think of it like in a time of war, like imagine the like case, I forget the name of it, but that established like gay rights was coming to the Supreme Court. Imagine that had been like against all social norms happening like 30 or 40 or 50 years before, like in wartime, it would be very different, because if the Supreme Court is embedded with, I think it's like a rational reading of like the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, with so much immense authority over the country, like it can kind of effectively change national laws on a dime. Like obviously they need rational arguments, but has that power to dramatically alter the laws of the nation in a way which can be deeply controversial and upsetting and threatening the unity of the nation, which is the core goal of the Constitution, is to
So what's your
unify the
point?
states. So that the idea that particularly controversial or dangerous or untimely cases can
Push
be
off.
delayed or like made an exception by the legislature makes sense.
I agree, and also I think that it also makes sense because a lot of what the Constitution is in nature is a limiting of the power of government, and I think that that's a lot, right, that's a lot of what it does, and so I think that if we think of that as the purpose of the Constitution, then I think that this would fit into that kind of
Yeah.
idea.
I like that now. I wonder though, if this is a correct reading, I wonder why the Congress in 1802, which was so worried about Stuart versus Laird because they knew that what they did was wrong, and decided to cancel the sittings of the Supreme Court for that year as a way to push it off. I wonder why they didn't use this clause and say we're making an exception for this case.
As in like, oh, why like?
Because Jacob would say that that's not what this was intended.
That's what he's
I
saying.
don't, I don't think it's in the spirit of it, but couldn't this give them the power to? Like to cover their mistakes?
But that would so clearly be wrong, and I think that hopefully although it seems like people are a lot of the time are more focused on their immediate agenda implications, but I think that the Congress at that time may have seen that if they did something like that, then they would be really corrupting.
I agree.
Like in the same way that like
what worries me
when
about that
Congress
reading is that it allows Congress to stop landmark cases before they happen. Like say the Harvard case, which is gonna go to the Supreme Court. What if Congress said, you know what? We understand that this could have huge implications. We don't want it to happen. There's nothing stopping them from doing that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Obviously, like, this is a question of, like, ultimately who's going to have the, like, superior authority. Like, is a dangerous question because it has to stop somewhere. But I think two things. One is, like, when we looked at 1802, like, Congress attempted to impeach a number of those judges in particular. Like, I think, like, some of the worst of the judges who had been, like, the most, like, seemingly authoritarian.
Samuel.
Chase.
Chase. And they failed. Like, it actually, like, I think one of the reasons why the Supreme Court is necessary and judicial review seems so necessary is precisely because that barrier of, like, 51, like, passing legislation is actually often very easy and, like, you know, last-minute amendment seemingly unconstitutional. Like, that seems very possible and seems to happen a lot, that there's something unconstitutional about legislation passed either by the Court of the United States or by state legislatures. But I think that the idea that, one, this would likely need to be done repeatedly. Like, this case could keep coming up. It was a dismissal of dozens and dozens of judges. So one, I think when Congress needs to pass a bill again and again and again, it is less likely to happen. Yeah, like the assault weapons ban, like that failed because it came up for a vote 10 years later and like they didn't have the votes. Like most bills passed. Yeah, like anything controversial in Congress is probably going to have relatively slim passage. And one of the limiting factors of the Constitution is like time. Like Senate is elected for like 6 years to stop like a temporary majority from seizing power. So just that if you win big in the election of 1800 doesn't mean that like in 1805.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we talk about?
Well, I also want to say that like I agree with all this, and I think that what our class is doing is making this like with such exceptions a huge deal and making it seem like it's something like gives way more leniency or ability or power to like
we should just do what Marshall does and leave out anything that's questionable.
Yeah, we should, a governing body. I mean, I completely agree. I think the most logical reading is for sure only applying to appellate jurisdiction and giving Congress this ability, and it's pretty clear, like saying like regulations as Congress shall make, but like saying that this gives like the Supreme Court the ability to just completely rule on cases that are not within their jurisdiction, I think is just so far-fetched and cannot reasonably be concluded by any single reading. I mean, I think that people who wrote the Constitution were so precise and to write a sentence and then write a period and then say, in all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court.
They're not precise at all.
One thing they are. I think they are here. I think they're really deliberate and they separate that. They talk about original jurisdiction.
The fact that there is so much conversation about it means that they
because
this is too many smart people with law degrees.
No, there's too many people with law degrees, but you can't outline every single case.
I mean,
there are exceptions,
deliberate.
but you really can't reasonably. And it's the same thing as the country's changing. It's like the necessary and proper clause. The role of the government isn't exactly always going to be the same thing, but it should never deviate so far from whatever was intended. And I think it's just crazy to interpret it as giving them way more original jurisdiction. And I think from this, it's saying in all other cases before mentioned, ones that are not applying to original jurisdiction, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, and there are such exceptions to these cases that Congress shall make.
Also, I think that it says that and those in which states may be party to the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction. It says it right there, and then I think it gets into the specifics. But so what really is the argument that it's not that?
Well, I think the argument, as I understand that, or at least the most commonly made argument against the idea that this is referring exclusively to appellate and is instead referring to like original, is because if the legislature has power over the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, that's in violation of separation of powers. Whereas I think if you read exceptions as exceptions and not like, you know, modification or altering or something like that, then it means that's actually like a very minute specific check on the authority of the Supreme Court that seems to comply with separation
So they
of powers.
could have been more deliberate by explaining
I'm
sure
I'm
all of these
saying I think they were deliberate in like the separation of these sentences.
See, that's an exception and not as a law in itself or a guideline.
The argument, basically the argument that people make is that Congress doesn't have like the balancing check and whatever and equal power, that Congress doesn't have this ability to just take away a really important power from another branch of government, and instead that Congress would just randomly give like extra powers. They're not going to give extra power to the Supreme Court if they don't see this fit. So the most logical reading, I'm not agreeing with this, but what other people say is that there are going to be cases where Congress believes it's the best way to handle a certain situation or urgent cases by giving the Supreme Court original jurisdiction, and that.
Can I think Article 6 for a few minutes also, because that's so important.
Yeah, so one other thing, I just want to say two other brief things. One is like an example of why I think that exceptions is applying to like letting them say specific cases don't fall under the Supreme Court's jurisdiction, is because I was reading about this thing, it's like in the height of the Civil War, there was a case surrounding like water issues and like which ways rivers flow, which like would have, like a totally minor case, but it was going to the Supreme Court, and it would have set alight tensions regarding like, I think it was like possession, like it would have potentially had massive effects on like the union of the unity because people had such strongly grounded interests of like which way a river flowed would have meant hundreds of miles of land falling under different regulations, and like tons of money was at risk. And the Supreme Court didn't get a chance to rule on it.
Did Congress?
I think Congress blocked it, I'm not 100% sure, but like maybe the Supreme Court just denied it, but at least like I think that's a time where it's like, oh, there's a pressing need for the Supreme Court not to make perhaps a landmark, but certainly a difficult decision.
And also, it could be supported by the fact that the Constitution is saying that there are some cases that are too sensitive for lower courts, which is why the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, and this is just the cases that are too sensitive for the Supreme Court.
Exactly. And I think the other thing is, on the note of lower courts, like, if we're saying that the Supreme Court has if the legislature can just adjust the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, that seems much more dangerous because, like, one, like, we have inferior courts for a reason. Like, the Supreme Court's not supposed to handle everything. And it means that, like, when a party has, like, ideologically affiliated judges, like right now the Republicans have
majority,
Democrats, like,
That's
they
true.
could just strip lower courts of the power. Because one of the checks on the Supreme Court is, like, they can only handle a few dozen cases a year, only a handful of them will be landmark. Like, you know, they need to weigh, are they going to set precedent on
You
environmental or
changed my
social?
reading.
Yeah, versus where, like, you know, the Ninth Circuit Court is, like, still a deeply liberal court. If the Supreme Court's authority is to expand massively, then the check of, like, different courts have different rulings, which allows for, like, a wider spectrum of, like, liberal and conservative understandings of the law to have possession, would be undermined if the Supreme Court was just given precedent over it by whichever party liked the Supreme Court.
I agree with that.
Should we get to 6?
Sure.
If we're at a consensus.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add on to something you were saying, but it's not great. It's just another addition.
You say it quickly.
It's just basically saying that if let's say there's just both the majority of one party were with Congress and the judicial branch, it would allow for for power to sway way more in one direction. So Congress gives Supreme Court original jurisdiction over way too many topics that the Supreme Court could basically control everything in law and just have way too much power and influence in the day-to-day life. I mean, they do, but there's this balance. But the way that this is set up is that it would only be taking away power from the Supreme Court, and because the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over cases and which is very important, they're never going to lose that power. All right, we can talk about
For 1 minute, Article 6.
Alright, well, I think that Article 6 is pretty clear in saying that the Constitution is the supreme law and the courts are the protectors of the Constitution, and that is their kind of duty to protect the Constitution. Does anybody have any opposition to that?
Agreed.
What do you think, Jacob?
I think it's a rational reading of the Constitution. The one thing I may say is I think there is a logically, intellectually serious argument that because the Constitution is a compact of the states, that ultimately authority does reside in states, not the federal government, as to the truth of the Constitution, which I think is
what it is. But what about just the
United
idea of protecting the Constitution itself, not determining what it says?
Yeah, I think clearly the courts are supposed to enforce the accuracy of laws, and I think everyone
As they see what they are.
Yeah, and I think everyone agrees.
Arising under the
Just so you guys know, class is over.
Yeah, I do think there is an intellectually sound argument against judicial.
Wait, Jacob, would you